This is a quiet story, told slowly. There's nothing you need to do, and nothing you need to remember. You can listen closely, or let the words fade into the background as you rest. The story will move gently, without sudden moments, and it will stay with you whether you're awake or drifting off. Tonight's story is The Last Train Home. Daniel arrived at the station earlier than he needed to, though he could not have said why. Habit, perhaps, or the quiet pull of not wanting to be anywhere else just yet. The platform lights were already on, casting an even glow across concrete, worn smooth by decades of waiting feet. The digital board overhead listed only one remaining service, its text steady and calm, free of the flicker that sometimes appeared earlier in the evening. This was the last train. The day ended with it. Daniel stood near the center of the platform, coat buttons against the cooling air, his overnight bag resting against his shin. The bag was lighter than it should have been for someone planning to be away more than a night, but he had learned to carry only what was necessary. Everything else had a way of weighing more than it helped. The air smelled faintly of metal and rain, though the sky above was clear. The rails still held the memory of heat from the day, releasing it slowly into the dark. A bench sat a short distance away, occupied by a man whose posture folded inward, as though he were trying to take up less space. He stared at his hands, turning them palm up and then down again, as if searching for something written there. Further along the platform, a woman stood beside a suitcase that looked well-traveled. One hand rested on the handle, not gripping it tightly, just enough to remind herself it was there. She watched the far end of the tracks without focus, her gaze aimed beyond sight. Daniel did not acknowledge them directly. Late platforms had their own etiquette. You shared space, not stories. The quiet felt agreed upon, rather than enforced. People who took the last train were usually finished speaking for the day. He glanced at his watch, then tucked his wrist back into his sleeve. He already knew the time. Minutes passed differently here. They stretched, not into impatience, but into something looser, something that allowed the mind to drift without resistance. Beyond the station, the town had already dimmed itself. Houses went dark, one by one. Roads emptied. Only this strip of light remained awake, holding those not yet ready to close a door behind them. Daniel thought briefly of the place he had left that evening. The building remained unchanged by his departure. He had walked out with the same measured steps he always used, and nodded goodbye in the same way. Nothing dramatic had happened. No raised voices. No final words that demanded remembering. Still, something had settled in his chest as he stepped away. A weight that was not quite regret, but not relief either. It lingered now, softened by distance, but not gone. A soft chime announced the approaching service. It was not loud, just enough to draw attention without startling anyone. Somewhere beyond the curve of the tracks, motion began, felt first as a vibration through the soles of Daniel's shoes. The man on the bench straightened slightly, then relaxed again. The woman adjusted her stance. Daniel took a breath he had not realized he was holding. The train entered the station without ceremony. Its headlights cut clean lines through the darkness, then slowed, settling into place with a tired exhale of metal and brakes. Doors opened, releasing a wash of warmer air and brighter light that spilled onto the platform. The contrast made the outside seem dimmer than before. Daniel stepped forward with the others. His shoes echoed briefly as he crossed the threshold into the carriage, the sound swallowed almost immediately by carpet and fabric. Inside, the air smelled of heat and upholstery, layered with the faint trace of many journeys. The seats were covered in muted colours, chosen, it seemed, to avoid strong feelings of any kind. He chose a seat by the window, out of habit, and placed his bag between his feet. The glass reflected his face faintly, softened by darkness and motion. It was a kinder reflection than most mirrors offered, smoothing edges and blurring lines that had grown more noticeable over the years. He looked tired, but not depleted. Ready was the word that came to him, though he did not linger on it. Across the aisle, the man from the bench sat down with care, lowering himself as though each movement required consideration. He rested his hands on his knees and closed his eyes almost immediately. Further down, the woman lifted her suitcase into the rack and sat facing forward. She held a book on her lap, but did not open it, her fingers resting on the cover as if the object itself was enough. The doors closed. The train began to move. At first, the motion was barely perceptible, a subtle rearranging of balance. Then the platform slid away, its lights stretching briefly before snapping back into points and vanishing altogether. The station returned to its waiting. Daniel leaned his head gently against the window and felt the vibration settle into something steady. Outside, the landscape offered little to see. Occasional lights appeared and disappeared, isolated homes or late shops holding out against sleep. Most of the world had already turned inward. There was comfort in moving quietly through it, leaving no mark, asking nothing in return. The sound of the rails found its rhythm. Daniel's breathing slowed to match it without effort. His shoulders eased, the tension of the day loosening its hold. The unsaid thing he carried was still there, but it no longer pressed so insistently. It blended into the general quiet, becoming part of the night rather than separate from it. At the first stop, the train slowed and the doors opened. One person stepped off, wrapped in a long coat, head slightly bowed. The doors closed again, and the train moved on. The space left behind did not feel empty. It felt complete, as though something had reached its proper end. Daniel watched the reflection in the window shift as the train gathered speed once more. Interior lights layered over darkness, present and past overlapping in softened shapes. He blinked slowly and let his eyes rest. He did not know exactly what waited for him at the end of the line. He knew only that he would arrive, step off, and walk the familiar route home. He would close the door behind him. The thoughts carried a quiet reassurance. The train continued on, unhurried, carrying him deeper into the night. The platform, the station, and the day itself folded away behind him. What remained was motion, warmth, and the steady understanding that for now, it was enough to be exactly where he was. Daniel did not remember falling asleep, only the sensation of drifting, the mind loosening its grip without ceremony. When he became aware again, it was not because something startled him, but because the train had shifted its rhythm. A gentle deceleration, a subtle change in sound. His eyes opened to the softened interior of the carriage. The lights were dimmer now, the night pressed close against the windows. The man across the aisle still slept, head tipped forward, breath even. The woman with the suitcase had opened her book at last, though her eyes moved slowly across the page, pausing often, as if the words mattered less than the act of holding them. Daniel adjusted his position and rolled his shoulders once, feeling the quiet complaint of muscles that had spent too long holding themselves together. The train slowed into another station. Doors opened. Cool air entered briefly, carrying the scent of damp stone and something faintly floral from nearby trees. No one boarded. No one left. The doors closed again, and the train continued on, as if the stop had existed only to remind the carriage that it could pause. Daniel's thoughts wandered, not with urgency, but with gentle persistence. Sleep never erased thinking entirely. It only softened it, rounding off sharper edges. He thought of the conversation earlier that evening, the one that had ended without conclusion. The words had been ordinary and practical. Still, something had been missing. Not an apology, not forgiveness, just a recognition that neither of them had offered. He had left because staying felt heavier than leaving. The decision had been quiet, made in the space between sentences. He wondered if the other person had noticed the moment it happened. He wondered if it mattered. The train carried him onward, and with each mile, the weight of that wondering shifted. It did not disappear, but it settled differently. Distance had a way of reorganizing things. What felt urgent up close often lost its sharpness when placed against movement and time. Outside, the darkness deepened. Lights grew fewer, spaced farther apart. Fields replaced streets, their outlines barely visible. The world beyond the glass felt larger now, less concerned with individual lives. Daniel found comfort in that. It reminded him that his own unrest was part of something wider, something that moved on regardless. He closed his eyes again, not fully sleeping this time, just resting them. The sound of the rails filled the space behind his thoughts. The heating clicked softly, adjusting itself to the cooling night. The carriage held its warmth, a contained pocket of comfort moving through open land. When he opened his eyes once more, the woman down the carriage was gathering her things. Her movements were unhurried and deliberate. The train slowed again, and when the doors opened, she stood and stepped into the aisle. As she passed Daniel's seat, she paused briefly. "Is this your stop too?" she asked, her voice low and even. Daniel shook his head gently. "Not yet," he said. She nodded, a small acknowledgement, then continued on. The doors closed behind her, and the train moved away from the platform. The carriage felt emptier now, though only one person had left. The space she had occupied did not echo. It simply existed differently. Daniel watched the reflection of the platform lights fade from the window. He felt a subtle shift inside himself, a recognition that journeys were made of these small departures as much as arrivals. Each stop rearranged the interior, even when nothing outwardly changed. The man across the aisle stirred, opened his eyes briefly, then straightened. He looked around, orienting himself, and offered Daniel a faint nod, a shared acknowledgement of having travelled together in silence. He stood as the train slowed again and stepped off at the next station without a word. The doors closed, and Daniel was alone in his section of the carriage. The quiet deepened. Not the tense quiet of isolation, but the settled quiet of space reclaimed. Daniel stretched his legs slightly and felt the carriage respond with a soft creak. He smiled, barely. Even trains had their own language of movement and rest. As the miles passed, his thoughts thinned. The unsaid things from earlier no longer demanded resolution. They existed now as facts rather than questions. He could carry them without strain. He realized, with mild surprise, that he felt lighter than when he had boarded. Not because anything had been fixed, but because he had stopped trying to fix it. The train slowed once more. Daniel glanced at the digital display above the door. 2 stops remaining. His chest tightened briefly at the knowledge, then eased. The end of the journey no longer felt like an edge. It felt like a continuation. He gathered his bag and placed it on his lap, fingers resting on the familiar strap. Outside, the lights of his town began to appear, scattered and gentle. The rails sang their steady song, and Daniel let himself be carried the rest of the way, present and unburdened, ready to arrive. The train slowed with a softness that felt deliberate, as though it understood the importance of arriving gently. Daniel stood as it came to rest, steadying himself with one hand on the seat in front of him. The doors opened, and cooler night air moved in, carrying the faint smell of wet pavement and distant trees. This station was smaller than the others, quieter, its lights fewer and spaced farther apart. It felt like a place designed for return rather than departure. He stepped onto the platform alone. The train's interior light fell briefly across the concrete, then withdrew as the doors closed behind him. The carriage began to move again, pulling away with its familiar sigh, leaving Daniel in a narrow pool of light. He watched until the red tail lights diminished and disappeared into the dark. The sound of the rails faded, and with it, the last sense of motion. The platform was empty now. No benches, no signs demanding attention. Just a simple shelter at one end, and a path leading down toward the exit. Daniel adjusted the strap of his bag and began to walk. His footsteps sounded louder in the absence of the train, each step measured and unhurried. There was no need to rush. The night held steady. As he left the station, the town opened around him in familiar shapes arranged quietly. Streetlights cast soft halos on the pavement, and house windows reflected them faintly, like distant stars. He followed the route he had walked so many times before, past closed shops and the small park where trees stood in shadow, their leaves barely moving. With each step, the remnants of the day fell away. The conversation from earlier no longer replayed itself. The weight he had carried loosened, not because it had been resolved, but because it had been set down. There would be time later, if it needed to be picked up again. Tonight did not ask for it. He reached his building and unlocked the door, stepping inside and closing it gently behind him. The hallway smelled faintly of cleaning solution and old carpet. The light came on without delay, steady and warm. Daniel climbed the stairs slowly, feeling the familiar rise and fall beneath his feet. Inside his flat, the air was still. He placed his bag down, hung his coat, and stood for a moment, listening. The quiet here was different from the quiet of the train. It was personal, shaped by his presence. He moved through the rooms with practiced ease, turning on a lamp and setting his keys in their place. He poured himself a glass of water and drank it slowly, standing by the window. Outside, the town rested. Inside, his breathing slowed, settling into a rhythm that felt right. He felt the gentle completeness of having arrived, not just in place, but in himself. When he finally lay down, the sounds of the night were distant and soft. Nothing demanded attention. Nothing pressed for resolution. Daniel closed his eyes and let the stillness hold him. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like, comment, share, and subscribe. Thank you for supporting the channel.